It is a project literally 60 years in the making, led by one man on a singular mission to make America's greatest sports car mid-engined. And the C8 Corvette finally did it. But it's so much more than just the C8. I could talk only about the C8 for a few minutes, and there's enough speculation too, sure. But there has been so much work over the last 60 years to try and get a mid-engine Corvette off the ground. That's where it gotta start. First launched in 1953, the Corvette was a bit of a rush job, completed in just 6 months, following positive reception from a concept car released earlier in 1952. That meant it had a pretty terrible 3.9-liter inline-six making just 150 horsepower. And sure, it was hand-built out of fiberglass, fancy, but it was also hand-built, which meant the quality was abysmal. Panel gaps were bigger than most cars. Things were so bad that sales were sliding into oblivion, and GM was this close to canning the whole program as a failure. But 3 things saved the Corvette brand. First, the Thunderbird 1955, and by obligation, GM had to rival it. 2. Chevy launched their first V8 in 40 years, a 265 small block. And 3, tying into that, we have the recently immigrated Russian engineer, Zora Arkus-Duntov, who single-handedly saved the Corvette by putting the V8 engine in it. He wasn't initially attached to the Corvette program. He got a 1953 chassis and threw the aforementioned 195 horsepower V8, and it went over 30 miles an hour faster than before, and most importantly, it sounded like a proper sports car should. It saved the Corvette, so he was appointed as the manager of the whole Corvette division just a year later. That is one of the many reasons why he's called the father of the Corvette. He's credited with everything from the Grand Sport in the early 60s to the first inboard disc brakes on a road car. But he had one ultimate goal for the Corvette. He saw the Cooper Formula One racers of the late 50s and early 60s and saw the future of the mid-engine layout, and he wanted it for the Corvette. But before jumping all in on a brand new Corvette, Zora was smart, and he decided to experiment on test vehicles called Chevrolet Experimental Research Vehicles, or SERVs, starting in 1960. Now, SERV 1 pretty much looks like a Formula One car. It's open-wheeler, single-seater, big tube. It looks exactly like an early 60s F1 car. And its only job was to provide engineers data and handling behavior across a wide range of conditions in a mid-engine layout. It was also a pretty darn good car that they were using as a test bed. The whole thing weighed just 1,600 pounds, the engine weighed just 350 pounds and made 350 horsepower, a rarity in that day and age, a rarity still today for naturally aspirated engines. It was one of the greatest engines ever made up to that point. And then Chevrolet did absolutely nothing with it, which is par for the course for the entire SERV program. Yeah, I know what you're saying, super nerds of GM. The suspension from the SERV 1 was used on the Stingray, but a good example of this is actually the SERV 2. It was basically a C2 Corvette Speedster with a 550 horsepower V8 mounted in the middle. It could do 212 miles an hour during testing, and it was destined to take on the GT40s at Le Mans. It even had a crazy four-wheel drive system using 2 gearboxes, one for each axle. But again, like the SERV 1, GM never did anything with it, and it was thrown into storage in 1970. Or what about the final SERV, SERV 3? It was arguably the most advanced car anywhere in the world in 1990, and that's a big claim given the 959 debuted a few years earlier from Porsche. And it had a 5.7-liter twin-turbo LT5 V8 making 650 horsepower, but this time it was surrounded by carbon fiber bodywork, a digital display, active suspension from the Lotus Formula One team, 4-wheel drive, 4-wheel steering, a top speed of 225 miles an hour, and most importantly, scissor doors. The only vehicles that rivaled the SERV 3 in terms of technology and advancement were the Williams Formula One cars of the era. Now, in fairness, GM really liked the SERV 3, but they didn't put it into production because it would have cost a minimum of $300,000 in 1990 money. So the Servs were great cars, but the Corvette was still nowhere near being a mid-engine layout. And as the third gen approached 1968, Zora was thinking that would be the perfect time to introduce a new platform. So Zora tried to get the public in on it when he debuted the XP880 Astro 2 at the New York Auto Show. It looked, to me anyway, like a cross between a Ferrari 308 and a Lamborghini Miura, but it had a 427 cubic inch V8 backing it up. But GM management axed the program because they didn't believe in creating a new Corvette platform, because according to them, we sell out of Corvettes we build, so why would we invest in anything new? Which, I mean, I guess is technically not wrong, but not how you say sustainable in the long term. But anyway, Zora, out of the stickler, did not give up. And just 1 year later, he had the XP882 concept ready. And then John DeLorean canceled the program. But luckily, Zora was able to hastily paint, sort of finish, a version of the XP882 in time for the 1970 New York Auto Show. And despite GM and DeLorean's best efforts, the public went nuts. So much so that DeLorean actually admitted he was wrong and reversed his decision to fully fund a big block version. And just as things were going to succeed, GM CEO Ed Cole got in the way. He thought the new Wankel rotary was the future, and said you can make a mid-engine Corvette, but only if it uses a rotary. Now, Zora hated rotaries, but if it meant getting a mid-engine Corvette, then he would become its best friend. So the XP882 was cut into the XP895, which was then cut up again to the XP987 GT by 1973. It had a two-rotor, designed in-house by GM, making a whopping 180 horsepower. And it was mounted to a Porsche 914 chassis, so calling it a Corvette is a bit of a stretch. And yet, GM doubled down on the rotary with the 1973 four-rotor Corvette. You guessed it, had a GM-designed quad-rotor making 480 horsepower. It was sleek, fast, mid-engine, and frickin' quad-rotor powered. That is Mazda 787B stuff, and it was in the mid-70s. It was an awesome car. And just as they were gaining traction, Ed Cole, Mr. Rotary himself for nothing at all, decided that they didn't want to make a rotary after all, and the project died out. And when the rotary Corvettes died, so did Duntov's motivation. He had tried for nearly a decade and a half to try and convince GM that this was the future. And even when he bowed to their every request, they laughed off his designs and were stuck in a cycle of profitable mediocrity. So in 1975, Zora retired, having never gotten his mid-engine Corvette. But literally a few months later, the Aerovette debuted in 1976. It was a cobbled-together version with a V8 and it was kind of pathetic. Sure, it looked like nothing else, but the 1970s emission rules dropped power to just 165 horsepower. But with gull-wing doors and Zora's retirement leaving a hanging sentiment in the office, GM management finally caved in and greenlit the Aerovette's mid-engine V8 for production. 21 years after Zora first pitched it, the Corvette would finally be mid-engined. Until his replacement Dan McClellan stepped in and canceled the program simply because of costs and traditions. As John DeLorean himself once said, GM simply has too many bean counters. GM actually built one more mid-engine concept in 1986 called the Corvette Indy, which is basically a precursor to the Serv 3 with similar looks and similar tech. However, instead of having a twin-turbo LT5, it had an honest-to-God 2.65-liter twin-turbo V8 from their most recent Indy car, making over 600 horsepower to the wheels. That basically became the Serv 3, and, well, again, nothing happened of it. And with the death of Serv 3, so was the dream of a mid-engine Corvette, and Zora passed away in 1996. But then we fast forward a whole long time to the C7 generation. The C7 Corvette was truly a legendary sports car, with the 755 horsepower ZR1 variant busting into proper supercar territory. But it also showed GM's engineers that they were maxing the physics of their front-engine design. So with new GM management overseeing, they finally launched the C8 Corvette with a mid-engine layout in 2019, 60 years after Zora first began experimenting with the Serv 1. Right now we only have the standard Z51 version, but it already seems like a future masterpiece. It's got a naturally aspirated 6.2-liter LT2 V8, making 495 horsepower, and with double wishbone suspension and GM's fantastic Magna Ride control, it's pretty damn good to drive. There was a bit of a mix-up when it came to overly soft suspension, if I recall, that made the front end seem less effective than it was in the early launch vehicles, but even GM explains how to fix that in about 5 seconds, so it's not the car, it's just them being overly cautious for literally no reason. It also looks pretty great. When I first saw it, I'll admit I wasn't so sure about the look. It does look a bit McLaren GT-ish, sort of the same, but it has grown on me, I quite like it. And all that, in theory, for less than $60,000 new, without markups, obviously. Now I could talk about the trunk on the back and the trunk in the front and all of that, but you don't really care, do you? No. You want faster versions, not this tame base one. Well, before we get to the road cars, technically there is the C8R GT Racer. Like Zora always wanted, GM is taking the mid-engine layout racing with immediate success. It debuted in the 2020 IMSA Sports Car Championship, where it won 6 out of 11 races, with another 3 podium finishes, sweeping the teams, constructors, and drivers' titles. And in 2021, they again won 8 races, taking another hat-trick of championships. And now they're currently leading in the 2022 season, although Porsche is making it a very close championship, with multiple wins apiece. But what about a car you can actually buy and drive on the road? Well, the first one that was announced is the Z06. And if this is just the start, we are in for a treat, because apart from the more aggressive aerodynamics, the Z06 also has a reworked 8-speed gearbox, with shorter ratios for better acceleration, wider tires and Michelin Cup 2s, more carbon fiber including ultra-lightweight carbon fiber rims, which alone shave 40 pounds, and a new LT6 V8. Like the LT2, it is a naturally aspirated V8, but that's where the similarities end, because Chevy engineers dropped $25,000 for a Ferrari 458 engine to reverse engineer, which may say something about your current engine lineup, Ferrari, if they're using an engine from almost 10 years ago. Just saying. The result from that reverse engineering was a 5.5-liter flat-plane crank V8 revving to 8,500 RPM, making 670 horsepower. It's the most powerful naturally aspirated V8 ever made. I don't think that record is going to go away anytime soon, as turbocharging and electric vehicles take over due to emission regulations. It's a gorgeous sounding masterpiece of engineering, and yet GM wants more. The ZR1 is supposed to be a twin-turbo Z06, with, again, if the reports are true, because everything after this is basically leaked reports and speculation, so fair warning. It's supposed to make 850 horsepower. Then you have the E-Ray, which replaces the Grand Sport in the Corvette lineage, and it's supposed to be a hybrid or an electric vehicle. There's sort of conflicting reports on that. There is going to be a hybrid, there's going to be an electric one. Either way, it will probably be all-wheel drive, also a first for the Corvette. But believe it or not, the ZR1 and E-Ray are not going to be the biggest Corvettes on the block. Because, again, according to leaked reports, a Corvette project is currently underway called the Zora, and is expected to be a hybrid version of the ZR1 with a reported 1,000 horsepower. The Z06 already clocks a 0 to 60 in 2.9 seconds, so what the hell is the Zora gonna do? Well, we'll have to wait and see until 2023 and 2024 and probably 2025, depending on how this release date schedule goes. To be honest, I really hope they stick with the Zora name, because I think it would be a fitting tribute to the man who fought tooth and nail to get this vehicle off the ground, but sadly was never able to see it.